Good afternoon, everyone. Lisa Homa here. Today we're going to talk about delegation and legal issues. I hope you're having a great day. The objectives for this lesson are to identify issues that nurses face with task delegation to unassisted licensed personnel and to discuss strategies for successful task delegation. We're on to Chapter 5, Legal and Ethical Aspects. So we're starting with federal laws that influence our practice, and that starts with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There are 11 operating units that influence laws surrounding healthcare delivery systems, and here are the 5 main domains, and we'll just go through them briefly. Payment of healthcare services, regulation of medical drugs and devices, vaccine programs, healthcare research, and patient safety. At the state and federal level that influence nursing, the federal government does not directly regulate nursing practice. So that means that most of the regulation comes from the state level. Nurses are regulated by 4 types of laws. It's criminal law, civil law, common law, and statutory law. In civil law, a private plaintiff versus a private defendant, versus what can happen with criminal law, where it's the government versus the defendant. So I commit a crime, I assault you, I do something, then the government's going to come after me to try to put me in jail because of that incident, versus a civil offense is something where, hey, you've wronged me and you're going to pay for that, mister. And then nurses are also influenced by common law is just based on customs or traditions. It can be decided by a judge and a jury. It can go to trial. In civil law, it's just a principle of legality. It's based on Roman law. It's a judge actively participates in seeking of evidence and examining of witnesses. The judge uses deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning. And for us in Pennsylvania, we live and die by the Nurse Practice Act. It's the state's duty to protect those who receive nursing care. It's the basis for all nursing licensure. The nurse must provide safe, competent nursing practice. It has to be grounded in the law as written by the State Nurse Practice Act and all the rest of the rules and regulations. In the course, we have the Nurse Practice Act, and you can see all the different rules and regulations that fall under that. And just examples of that are, how often do I have to renew a license in Pennsylvania? What happens if my license is suspended? All those laws are in there and you can view all those things. So together, the Nurse Practice Act, rules and regulations guide and govern nursing practice. A scope of practice is different. It describes the services that a qualified health professional are deemed competent to perform in terms of their nursing license. Now we move where things start to get ugly. We talk about malpractice and negligence. So the burden of proof is on the plaintiff. If I am a patient and someone has either negligence or malpractice, as a plaintiff attorney, it is my duty to prove these 4 tiers. If I go to trial, I have to prove that there's duty of care owed to the patient. That means, hey, this nurse should have taken this kind of care to me. To a breach of duty showing, so an expert would come in and establish the standard of care, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Then the attorney has to show that that nurse, in fact, fell below the minimum standard of care, so they have a breach of duty. They have to show that the patient was hurt as a result of it and that the nurse's direct actions caused the damages. Most common areas in nursing where we see nurses going to court is failure to use equipment in a responsible manner, failure to assess and monitor, or failure to communicate to the appropriate party. I see that all the time. So I've been doing medical malpractice cases or catastrophic personal injury since 2008, and I see failure to document, failure to act as a patient advocate. That's a huge one. Those are the main areas of malpractice. And then HIPAA compliance. So I think we're HIPAA'd out, and all of you at work, wherever you work, probably have to take some type of HIPAA training. Even in education, we have to do that. And we've required it for clinical documentation. So I'm not going to spend very much time on this at all. HIPAA was passed in 1996. It's a set national standard for protection of patient information. Nurses are also guided by the International Council of Nurses Code of Ethics. It's a revision in 2012. It identifies 4 fundamental responsibilities of the nurse: to promote health, illness, to restore health, and alleviate suffering. Again, so we're guided by all of these influences. We're also guided by the ANA Code of Ethics. Essentially, what this says is nurses take action in order to improve the environment of patients, themselves, other nurses, and members of the interprofessional team. Nurses should not only just be licensed and maintain their licensure, but they should participate in professional organizations to assist in advancing healthcare policy, to weigh in on civic values, professional standards, and clinical practice protocols. Nurses also should take action to collaborate with the public and to promote community, national, and international efforts to meet the healthcare needs of the community. So again, the Code of Ethics for nurses is actually a big thing. If you're dealing with an ethical issue, nurses say, oh, that doesn't do anything, but it really does guide you in some way. It tells you where our responsibility lies. On to Chapter 6. There is a national guideline for nursing delegation, and as you can see, it talks about the three main domains. NCSBN says that any decision to delegate a nursing responsibility must be based on the needs of the patient or population, the stability and predictability of a patient's condition, the documented training and competence of the delegate, and the ability of the licensed nurse to supervise the delegated responsibility and its outcome. So we do get some type of guidance from NCSBN, but guess where we get the most guidance on what we can delegate? And that's, of course, our PA Nurse Law, our PA Nurse Practice Act. And these are the major domains that you have to consider when you think about delegating. Domains are responsibility, so you have to make sure that whoever you're giving a task to, that the person accepts and owns responsibility for whatever it is that you delegated to them. You have to make sure that the delegated responsibility, meaning the nurse, has to be a nursing activity, a skill, or a procedure that is transferred from a licensed nurse to somebody, to a person, whoever you're giving that to. Assignment means is the routine care activities or procedures that are within the authorized scope of practice of the RN. And parts of that are accountability, to be answerable to oneself, to be responsible for own choices, decisions, and actions against the Code of Ethics for nurses. Under authority of this, the right to act or to command the action of others. And then supervision is the provision of guidance or direction, evaluation, and follow-up by the licensed nurse to make sure that the task was done appropriately and that the patient is safe. And where a nurse delegated vital signs to a tech, and the tech never reported the abnormalities to the nurse. But there are 5 rights of delegation to make sure that this is a task, in fact, that is delegatable. I will burst your bubble and tell you in Pennsylvania there are no delegation, and we'll get into that in just a second. So if you were allowed to delegate, which you're not, it should be the right task, the right circumstance, the right person, the right direction or communication, and the right supervision in doing that. And then delegation in Pennsylvania, here it is, PA Nurse Practice Act contains no delegation language. RNs licensed in PA may not delegate nursing functions to unlicensed personnel. Not kidding. 1994, the PA State Board of Nursing attempted to add regulations about delegation, and the board's response was, if the General Assembly had intended to grant RNs the authority to delegate functions to any other supportive personnel, it would have specifically provided it within the nursing law in the first place. Basically, they're saying if they wanted it, they would have included it, but because they didn't, guess what? We can't delegate. And then the chain of command, so we are influenced by the chain of command. Let's say that I have unsafe staffing conditions on the floor. What do I do about that? Well, I would take it to my charge nurse first. I would take it then to house supervisor has a different chain of command. But the bottom line is many organizations are very strong on chain of command. And if you breach the chain of command or if you fail to go up the chain of command, so let me give you an example. Let's say I have a physician who refuses to come down. Let's say you think your patient's having a stroke. And let's say that the physician refuses to come assess that patient, which is his duty. And then you know the patient, something really bad is happening on the floor. You have a duty as a nurse to follow the chain of command to ensure that someone will come and look at that patient. And what I mean is we have the responsibility and the right as a nurse to go as high up as we feel like we need to in order to get care to that patient. We can take it as high as the medical director in the hospital if we need to. Chain of command is really important. It's also important if you have a boss, and let's say you went over your boss's head about something, or your boss finds out about something that you should have told them about by someone else. That usually doesn't go over well. So chain of command is really important, especially if you're in a leadership role. And then scope of practice. So scope of practice, this is the decision-making framework. An example is an RN is responsible for clinical judgment. Another example is we're responsible for client education, discharge education, and let's say clinical judgment, whether or not a patient is stable enough to give a blood transfusion. And these are all the frameworks. So it can be determined by acuity of patients, prioritizing patient needs, it could be by state law, policy procedures, patient care standards, accreditation, and then what is scope of practice versus what the heck is standard of care? To me, standard of care is, so scope of practice are professional activities defined under state law, determined by each state's Nurse Practice Act. And actually, there's a typo on the second part. That should be standard of care is a provision of services that are delivered in a manner consistent with care. And so if you go into any hospital and you say, okay, well, tell me what your standard of care is, it is not just one document. Standard of care takes into account every piece of regulation that there is. It can be the Nurse Practice Act. It can be policies and procedures from your institution. Basically, you take a summary of all those documents and you decide if in fact the nurse, if any RN was put in that same situation that you were in, would they deliver the same care as you did, or would they have made the same error that you committed? Essentially, it is the minimum criteria for job proficiency. It is the minimum expected level of care. Medical malpractice and negligence occur when a nurse fails to provide the minimum standard of care to a patient. So then if you don't maintain standard of care, then you are committing negligence. And that's all I have. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening.